The world revered David Bowie as an artistic saint, but behind the glam rock facade, his aura was merely a perfect trap to prey on 14-year-old girls. Even more cruelly, an entire media empire colluded in whitewashing this sick exploitation, heartlessly crowning a child to transform the filthy abyss of rock and roll into a desirable illusion. Los Angeles in the early 1970s had become a city where the wreckage of 60s idealism gave way to glamour, excess, and status. The Sunset Strip was the visible center of that world, and glam rock arrived there as something theatrical, androgynous, and intoxicatingly new. Rodney Bingenheimer's English disco became one of its best-known gathering points, a cramped, loud club where musicians, photographers, press, and very young girls move through the same charged space. The people managing the door of the English disco were not blind. They checked identification cards, looked at dates of birth, and could clearly see how young many of the girls were. Yet they still allowed them in, and in some cases appeared to guide the youngest and most noticeable girls toward the most exclusive areas of the club. Sable Starr walked through those doors. Her real name was Sable Hay Shields. Raised in the affluent coastal suburb of Palos Verdes, she traded her geometry homework for the Sunset Strip. Dressing to appear at ease in an adult world, she wanted to be close to the music. More accurately, she wanted to be close to the power that the music generated. The media eagerly documented her descent. They published her photographs in national magazines. They interviewed her as if she were a seasoned industry insider, a peer to the adult men around her. They gave her a title, the Queen of the Groupies. They printed those words in bold black ink across glossy pages. It was a validation of the darkest possible kind. When an established, respected publication tells a child she is a queen, the child believes it. The title rewrites her internal reality. She stops seeing the danger inherent in her environment. She stops seeing the older, drug-addicted men as dangerous adults. The media framing convinces her that she is not a victim, but a conqueror. She sees these men as subjects in her court. Her royalty was a manufactured illusion, fueled by flash photography and ending in standard hotel rooms at the Hyatt Continental. The rock stars understood the power of that psychology and benefited from it. David Bowie did not arrive in Los Angeles simply as a musician playing a set list of songs. He arrived portraying Ziggy Stardust, an alien messiah sent to save a dying Earth. This persona was not just performance art. It also created a powerful aura that could easily overwhelm a very young person. A 14-year-old girl is conditioned by society and her parents to be wary of a 25-year-old man in a standard suit approaching her in a bar. The alarms sound. The threat is recognizable. But a 14-year-old girl does not run from a shimmering androgynous star with bright red hair, who speaks in riddles and offers a ticket out of suburban monotony. The costume lowers a young person's instinctive sense of caution. The theatricality makes the interaction feel like participation in a living movie, rather than a serious legal and moral problem. Bowie and others in his echelon projected the kind of larger-than-life self-image that often surrounds major stars. The power dynamic in these interactions was not merely unequal. It was entirely one-sided. The musician held the fame, the wealth, the cultural influence, the protection of a corporate legal team, and the unconditional adoration of millions. Sable Starr held a fake identification card and a tube of lip gloss. According to numerous accounts and her own later interviews, the interaction was carefully framed by the adults involved as a meeting of kindred spirits, a collision of two unique souls. Many rock historians note that in reality, it rested entirely on her youth and vulnerability. There was no physical coercion required. Force is messy. Force attracts police attention. The coercion was entirely environmental and psychological. The glam rock scene promoted a philosophy of absolute uninhibited freedom, free love, free expression, free access to narcotics, the rejection of all traditional boundaries. For a teenager whose brain is biologically wired to rebel against authority and seek out novelty, this philosophy sounds like a utopia. It could easily become a tool that weakened a young person's boundaries. When a child enters an environment where all societal rules are explicitly suspended, they rely on the adults in that environment to establish new parameters of safety. The adults in the English disco and the surrounding hotel suites were the very people benefiting from the lack of safety. They did not offer protection. They offered drugs and alcohol. These substances deepened the atmosphere of confusion and dependence. They created a false, accelerated sense of closeness. They artificially lowered inhibitions and impaired judgment. They made a chaotic and deeply unsafe situation feel like an exclusive, glamorous party. A young person under the influence of heavy substances does not question the power imbalance. She simply floats along with the current, guided by the adults who controlled the room. Sable Starr traded geometry homework for the Sunset Strip. Her early years weren't derailed in one sudden event. It was systematically dismantled night after night. She learned to speak the cynical language of managers, publicists, and roadies. She learned to navigate the complicated social hierarchy of a hotel suite at 3 a.m, adapting to a nightlife culture shaped by illicit substances, exhaustion, and constant pressure. She adapted to the adult world because the environment demanded it, and because she genuinely believed she was already an adult. The media reinforced this fatal delusion every time they pointed a camera at her. The transition appeared seamless to the outside observer. She was a student sitting in a classroom on a Friday afternoon, and a rock muse holding court at the Rainbow Bar and Grill by Friday night. But the contrast between her internal neurological development and her external reality was severe. Inside, she still had the judgment and emotional development of an impressionable youth. She lacked the maturity to assess long-term consequences, process complex manipulation, or recognize danger disguised as affection. Outside, she was living in an adult world shaped by substances, intense social pressure, and older veterans of the music industry. The gap between her internal capacity and her external actions was massive. That gap is where long-term harm could take root while the music played on. Rodney Bingenheimer's English disco was not an accident of geography. It was a highly specific environment, engineered for a highly specific purpose. You do not build a club on the Sunset Strip without understanding the local economy. The local economy was rock and roll. The currency was access. The club owner understood this. He knew that to attract the most lucrative clientele, the British rock stars, the platinum-selling musicians, the men who generated millions in revenue, he had to provide an environment that catered to their specific demands. Those demands crossed clear legal and moral lines. The front door of the club was the first line of complicity. A nightclub door is a filter. It is designed to keep out the unwanted and protect the business inside. The men working the door at the English disco were large, imposing figures. They were not unintelligent. They knew how to read a California driver's license. They knew the difference between a real document and a crude forgery. They watched young hopefuls approach the door, many of them obviously too inexperienced for the world they were trying to enter. The bouncers at the English disco performed simple mental arithmetic. Recognizing highly impressionable individuals, they consciously lifted the velvet rope. They traded their moral compass for a steady paycheck, acting as gatekeepers who knowingly funneled these youths into an adult ecosystem. Inside, the club was a sensory assault. The music was played at a volume designed to prevent normal conversation. This was not an oversight. It was a tactic. When people cannot hear each other, they cannot communicate effectively. They rely on physical cues. They rely on proximity. The loud music isolated the young attendees from their peers. It forced them to lean in close to the older men. It created a forced artificial intimacy. The lighting was equally deliberate. It was dark. Strobe lights flashed, disorienting the patrons. The darkness provided cover. It hid the exact age of the guests. It hid the exchange of illicit substances. It hid the imbalance in the room. The VIP section was the ultimate destination. It was usually an elevated area, separated from the main dance floor by a physical barrier. This architecture served two purposes. First, it allowed the rock stars to look down on the crowd, reinforcing their status as deities. Second, it created a controlled enclosure. Once a young person was invited into the VIP section, she was cut off from the rest of the room. She was surrounded by the musician, his management, his roadies, and his security guards. She was isolated and surrounded by adults. The club management actively serviced this enclosure. Waitresses brought bottles of expensive beverages. They did not ask the younger arrivals in the VIP section for identification. They poured the drinks. They provided the ashtrays. They wiped down the glass tables where chemical substances were used openly. The entire staff of the nightclub appeared willing to look away. They witnessed the power imbalance and serious warning signs in plain sight. They chose silence. Silence ensured the tips kept flowing. The music press helped carry that world outward. Photographers roamed the dark corners of the English disco. They were looking for marketable images. A marketable image in the early 1970s was a famous rock star engaging in decadent behavior. The photographers saw adult men sitting with children. They did not put down their cameras. They did not alert the authorities. They adjusted their focus and pressed the shutter. These photographers became part of a system that turned deeply troubling scenes into marketable images. The magazines bought these images. The editors looked at the contact sheets. They saw the ages of the girls. They made the editorial decision to publish the photographs without warnings or condemnations, replacing them with captions that glorified the scene. This visual strategy was profoundly destructive. It normalized the presence of very young girls in adult drug-fueled environments, signaling to readers across the country that this behavior was acceptable, desirable, and cool. The magazines acted as a recruitment tool. Young girls in small towns saw the pictures of Sable Starr. They saw a girl their own age standing next to a rock god. They read the articles that praised her lifestyle. The media created a false narrative of glamour and power. They omitted the reality of the drugs, the manipulation, and the emotional damage. They manufactured a dangerous illusion that lured countless other vulnerable teenagers to Los Angeles, seeking a crown that did not exist. The journalists and editors traded their ethical responsibilities for access to the musicians and increased circulation numbers. They advanced their careers while ignoring the damage being done to the girls they photographed. The illusion of artistic romance is fragile. It shatters easily in the harsh daylight. David Bowie eventually packed his elaborate stage costumes into road cases. The Los Angeles leg of the tour ended. The spaceship prepared to move on to the next city. Bowie got into a limousine, drove to the airport, and boarded a plane. He returned to his adult life, his management meetings, his financial investments, and his career trajectory. Sable Starr stayed in Los Angeles. She was left behind while the star moved on. The emotional devastation of that abandonment is difficult to overstate. A 14-year-old child does not possess the psychological armor required to process being discarded by an individual they view as a deity. She had restructured her entire identity around his presence. She had alienated her family. She had abandoned her education. She had committed fully to a reality that vanished the moment his flight took off. The cognitive dissonance is paralyzing. You are told you are a queen, but you are left alone in an empty room with nothing but a hangover and a fake ID. But the machinery of the Sunset Strip does not pause for heartbreak. The English disco was open the next night. The VIP section had a vacancy. The supply of musicians was endless. The scene demanded new faces, and the girls, desperate to regain that lost feeling of importance, returned to the club. The void left by Bowie's calculated, theatrical presence was quickly filled. Sable moved into the orbit of Iggy Pop. The transition marked a dangerous descent. The theatrical facade of Glam Rock began to peel away, revealing a harsher reality. Iggy Pop brought a more volatile and destructive element to her life. The remaining illusions of glamour faded entirely into grit. The nature of the environment shifted. The drugs changed. It was no longer just champagne, marijuana, and the occasional pill. The substances became heavier, darker, and more destructive. The nights stretched longer. The physical danger increased. The mental toll on a developing teenager became catastrophic. The girls in this world often became emotional support systems for troubled adult men who gave very little back. Sable was no longer just a muse sitting in the corner looking pretty. She was expected to absorb chaos, soothe egos, and survive emotional volatility. She was a 15-year-old girl tasked with managing the drug come-downs of grown men. She was forced to soothe their bruised egos, navigate their paranoid delusions, and clean up their physical sickness. It was an exhausting, parasitic dynamic. The adult stars at the center of this world often consumed attention and devotion while offering very little in return. The girls were aging in dog years. Their bodies were young, but the relentless pace of rock and roll excess was taking a visible toll. They were surviving on a mix of narcotics and desperate validation, a lifestyle that took a severe physical and mental toll. The downward trajectory continued. The pattern only deepened as the scene grew darker and harder to escape. The highs require more potent chemicals. The boredom requires more extreme behavior. Sable Starr's path intersected with Johnny Thunders, of the New York Dolls, the descent reached the absolute bottom. With Thunders, the illusion of glamour was completely eradicated. There were no sequined costumes. There were no philosophical conversations about art or space travel. There was only heroin, and with it came a world stripped of glamour, stability, and ordinary human balance. Sable was pulled into this vortex of addiction. The VIP rooms of the English disco were replaced by dirty hotel rooms and squalid apartments. The flashing cameras of the rock press were replaced by the harsh reality of withdrawal sickness. She was witnessing the slow, agonizing suicide of the men she idolized, and she was being dragged down with them. The young girls in this orbit were paying for that life in slow, devastating ways. The psychological damage sustained during this period could be long-lasting. A child exposed to severe, untreated addiction, physical decay, and the constant threat of overdose suffers profound trauma. They can come to associate love with sickness and to measure their value by how much chaos they can endure. They are stripped of their dignity, their health, and their future. The music industry continued to profit from the records these men produced, while showing little interest in the harm left behind. The Sunset Strip operated on a ruthless, unspoken biological clock. The defining characteristic of a baby groupie was her youth. Her youth is her currency. The taboo nature of the interaction intensified the imbalance. The power dynamic was not incidental. It was central. A grown man with millions of dollars does not seek out a 14-year-old girl because he wants an intellectual equal. He seeks her out because the imbalance gives him overwhelming control. When a girl in this ecosystem approaches her 18th birthday, the entire dynamic begins to collapse. The countdown is brutal. The moment she turns 18, she becomes a legal adult in the eyes of the law. She acquires legal agency. She can sign a contract. She can file a lawsuit. The thrill of the forbidden vanishes instantly. The power dynamic shifts just enough to make the older men uncomfortable. She is no longer a child they can easily influence. She is a woman who might demand accountability. The transition is abrupt. The moment she ages out of the scene's unspoken demographic, her access is routinely revoked. The velvet rope, which used to part magically upon her arrival, suddenly remains closed across the entrance. The large men at the door look past her. They tell her the club is at capacity. The photographers, who used to beg for her picture, do not waste their expensive film on her. The rock stars, who used to demand her presence, do not recognize her. They are looking past her shoulder. They are looking at the new crop of 14-year-olds queuing on the pavement. The scene simply moves on from the people it once celebrated. It has extracted the youth, the energy, and the novelty. It has no use for a damaged, addicted 18-year-old woman. The psychological toll of this sudden rejection is devastating. Sable Starr and the girls of her generation were expelled from the only world they understood. They had spent their most critical formative years, the years when a person usually develops an identity, learns social skills, and prepares for adulthood, navigating the vices of adult men in dark rooms. They had no formal education to fall back on. They had abandoned high school for the Sunset Strip. They had no resume. They had no practical work experience. More importantly, they had no understanding of normal interpersonal relationships. They only knew how to exist in a transactional environment where affection was traded for access. They only knew how to cater to the egos and instability of addicted adults. When they were thrust into the real world, they were completely unequipped to survive. They were left entirely alone. The culture that created them simply turned its back. The record labels did not offer severance packages. The club owners did not offer apologies. The journalists did not write follow-up articles about their struggles. The girls who aged out were left to deal with the severe substance abuse issues they had developed while running with the musicians. They faced deep, crushing depression. They experienced a total loss of identity. Who are you when the only thing that made you special, your youth and your proximity to fame, is taken away? They were cast out of the scene, carrying profound, invisible psychological damage. They were the collateral damage of a culture that celebrated male freedom at the expense of girls who were far too young. They were caught in a system that commodified youth, used it, and moved on. The music played on, the cash registers rang, and the girls were left to fade into the silence of their ruined lives. The flashing red and blue lights of the Los Angeles Police Department cruisers illuminated the Sunset Strip every single night. The black and white patrol cars parked directly outside the entrance of Rodney Bingenheimer's English Disco. Uniformed officers stood on the pavement with their hands resting on their heavy leather utility belts. Their physical presence was theoretically meant to signal order. It was meant to project the unyielding authority of the law. The reality was a grotesque inversion of justice. The police appeared less interested in questioning what was happening than in controlling crowds and protecting celebrity movement. A fleet of black limousines idled constantly at the curb. The heavy engines hummed. The dark-tinted windows completely hid the occupants from the street. When the heavy car doors opened, the crowds of onlookers and fans pressed forward. The police presence prioritized crowd control, ensuring the musicians could walk from their luxury vehicles to the club entrance without being touched, delayed, or questioned by anyone. 50 feet away inside the dark, thumping rooms of the club, multiple acts raising serious legal and ethical questions were unfolding inside. These were serious allegations with enormous moral weight. They carried mandatory prison sentences in any other zip code in the United States. But on the Sunset Strip, the law seemed to stop at the velvet rope, blurred by fame and commercial power. The officers standing on the street could hardly have missed the larger reality around them. It was not a tightly guarded secret. The girls walking past them into the venue were clearly under the legal age of consent. Many of the girls looked unmistakably young, even beneath heavy makeup. Officers saw the minors, checked their watches, and waited for their shifts to end, choosing silence over intervention. Fame creates a massive jurisdictional blind spot. Wealth generates an impenetrable legal force field. A rock star in the 1970s was not just a musician strumming a guitar. He was a multinational corporation. He generated millions of dollars for the record labels. He generated massive tax revenue for the city of Los Angeles. The local economy thrived on the influx of tourists, the sold-out arenas, and the booming nightlife economy. You do not arrest the economic engine. You protect it at all costs. The city seemed to value the money and glamour surrounding the musicians more than the safety questions surrounding the scene. The young girls sitting in the VIP section looked out the dark windows. They saw the police cars parked outside. A child is taught from birth to seek out a police officer in times of danger. The girls in the club learned a devastatingly different lesson. They realized the police were the palace guards. The guards were there solely to protect the kings. The girls were merely the entertainment provided for the kings. There would be no rescue. To the girls inside, the authorities did not look like rescuers. That realization could breed a deep cynicism. It teaches a young, developing mind that society is rigged and that justice is an illusion sold to the poor. The music industry employed an army of highly paid enablers to maintain a striking degree of legal insulation. Managers, publicists, and professional fixers formed an aggressive protective ring around the artists. Their sole job was to anticipate legal problems and eliminate them entirely before they reached the public record. If a young girl suffered a severe drug overdose in a hotel room, no one dialed for an ambulance. An ambulance brings police. An ambulance brings unwanted questions. Instead, they called the fixer. A private, highly paid doctor on retainer was summoned directly to the suite. The girl was chemically stabilized, injected with vitamins, and placed quietly into the back of a taxi. The incident was entirely erased. No paperwork, no police report, nothing that acknowledged what had happened. If a parent discovered exactly where their teenage daughter was spending her nights and attempted to intervene, the machine reacted with ruthless efficiency. The parents were not met with apologies or explanations from the musicians. They were met with the massive legal department of a major record label. They received intimidating cease and desist letters. They were threatened with ruinous defamation lawsuits. They were told in clear, sharp legal terms that any attempt to go to the press or the police would result in total financial destruction. The lawyers were aggressive and terrifying. The parents were usually average middle-class citizens with mortgages and regular jobs. They lacked the resources to fight a corporate behemoth. They backed down out of sheer terror. They locked their daughters in their bedrooms. The daughters simply climbed out the windows and went right back to the club. The machine usually won. The flash bulbs faded in the morning, but the printed page remained forever. Some of the most influential enablers of this ongoing tragedy were not just the men holding the guitars and the microphones. They were the men holding the pens and the editorial power. The music press of the 1970s completely abandoned their fundamental journalistic duty. They did not act as a watchdog for a corrupted industry. They often seemed closer to a promotional wing for the scene than to a watchdog over it. Magazines and underground music papers dedicated entire glossy spreads to Sable Starr and her peers. They did not investigate the sudden alarming influx of minors into adult drug-fueled nightclubs. They actively celebrated it. They turned a severe child protection issue into a symbol of cutting-edge sophistication. The journalists sat down and interviewed a 14-year-old girl with the solemn reverence usually reserved for seasoned artists. They asked her detailed questions about her fashion choices. They asked her about her favorite musicians and her opinions on the current state of rock and roll. They never asked the fundamental question regarding her age. They never asked why a child was sleeping in a hotel suite with a man a decade older. By crowning a 14-year-old queen, the media manufactured a seductive illusion of agency. This deliberate editorial choice erased her status as a minor, preemptively absolving the rock stars, while providing a perfect ethical loophole for readers, record executives, and photographers. The title made the severe power imbalance effortless to ignore, framing the exploitation as nothing more than her self-created mythology. This was the genius of the media construction. It turned a profoundly unequal dynamic into a seductive fantasy of female power. It taught the girls to misread their own situation. It taught them to interpret attention as authority. It taught them to see access as control. But access is not control. Visibility is not safety. A girl standing beside a famous man in a photograph may look powerful to an outside observer, but that image reveals nothing about the imbalance behind it. The press knew that scandal and glamour could be sold together if packaged correctly. They did not need to deny what the public could already see. They only needed to rename it. They only needed to aestheticize it. Once the story was framed as daring, glamorous, and liberated, the moral discomfort began to fade. The problem was no longer a problem. It became a scene. That scene generated its own momentum. Young girls across the country read those magazines and saw a version of womanhood distorted by fame. They saw teenage girls treated like royalty because famous men wanted them nearby. They saw photographs that suggested this life was glamorous, elevated, and desirable. They were not shown the exhaustion, the fear, the confusion, the emotional collapse, or the long aftermath. They were shown the image without the cost. This is how an exploitative culture sustains itself. It does not need to force every girl into the room. It only needs to convince enough of them that walking in is a form of triumph. Once that belief takes hold, the rest of the machinery can keep running with very little resistance. The girls competed with each other because the system rewarded competition. If one girl gained access, another lost it. If one girl was photographed, another disappeared into the background. The scarcity of attention made the entire world feel high stakes. The pressure to stay visible became part of the trap. To remain in the orbit of fame, the girls had to keep performing the role the scene demanded of them, and then the scene would move on anyway. That is the brutality of these worlds. They promise transformation, but what they often deliver is disposability. The girls, who had once been celebrated as queens of the scene, were not being prepared for adulthood. They were being absorbed into an economy of attention that had no long-term use for them. Once the novelty faded, they were expected to vanish quietly. For the men, the story was different. They had careers. They had lawyers, managers, publicists, record deals, future albums, and the full machinery of reinvention. When one phase ended, another began. They could move to a new city, cut a new record, adopt a new image, and reframe the past as a period of wild artistic excess. The culture was eager to help them do it. For the girls, there was rarely such mercy. When the spotlight moved, it did not leave behind a path back to normal life. It left behind addiction, emotional confusion, broken education, isolation from family, and years of mislearned survival. The habits that kept a girl alive inside the scene did not help her build a stable life outside it. The strategies that had once brought access now brought ruin. Trust was warped. Intimacy was warped. Self-worth was warped. A life built around being chosen by powerful men leaves very little room to become a person on your own terms. The aftermath of this era proved just as defining as its manufactured glamour. It is not enough to say that the girls were used by the scene and then discarded. You also have to understand what discarding actually means. It means waking up in a world for which you were never properly prepared. It means carrying damage into jobs, relationships, families, and years that arrive long after the music has stopped. It means trying to live with memories that culture itself keeps romanticizing. Sable Starr was not the only one to carry that burden, but her story became one of the clearest symbols of it. Even later, when people spoke about her with nostalgia, they often continued to use the old vocabulary. They continued to use the word groupie. They refused to use the accurate terminology. Words that would have plainly named the seriousness of what was happening were completely absent from the narrative. The media actively participated in the continued erasure of the victims to preserve the cultural monuments they had built. Acknowledging the reality of the crimes would mean dismantling the legacy of men considered to be musical geniuses. Society collectively decided that the music was simply too important to be tainted by the truth. This systemic denial is a secondary form of abuse. It tells the victim that her reality does not matter. It tells her that her pain is an acceptable casualty in the production of great art. When a survivor sees her abuser standing on a stage, accepted into the canon of genius, applauded by millions, the message is unmistakable. Your life was the price of someone else's legend, and the culture has decided the legend was worth it. That is why the anger around this story remains so volatile, even decades later. It is not only anger at the men involved, it is anger at the club owners who looked away. It is anger at the journalists who turned her abuse into a fashion statement. But this rage has nowhere to go. The statute of limitations on the crimes committed against them expired decades ago. The perpetrators are untouchable. They are insulated by wealth, armies of lawyers, and a culture that violently protects its idols. The survivors are left with memory, and memory is a brutal courtroom because it offers testimony without consequence. By the time Sable Starr left Los Angeles, the myth had already hardened around her. She was no longer a person to the culture. She was a symbol. The scene that had once used her image as decoration now had no use for her at all. She moved to Nevada. She stepped into a radically different world. She worked in casinos. She dealt cards. The surveillance cameras on the ceiling monitored the staff and the patrons with cold objectivity. There were no velvet ropes hiding dangerous behavior. The transactions were transparent. You placed your chips on the felt, and the dealer dealt the cards. It was a clean transactional environment, a stark contrast to the manipulative transactions of the Sunset Strip. But changing geography does not erase conditioning. The body remembers what the culture wants to forget. Years of exploitation do not simply dissolve because the setting changes. The girls who survived that world often carried its logic inside them for the rest of their lives. They had been trained to understand attention as affection, volatility as intimacy, and proximity to power as value. They had learned in their earliest attempts to build adult identities that their primary function was to serve the narcissistic demands of addicted men. When you remove the rock stars and the cocaine, the underlying behavioral conditioning remains intact. The survivors often found themselves drawn to chaotic, destructive partners, recreating the only dynamic they implicitly understood. The anger comes much later. In the immediate aftermath of the exploitation, the victims are usually consumed by confusion, depression, and a desperate desire to simply survive the withdrawal from the chaotic lifestyle. The realization of what was actually stolen takes years to fully crystallize. By the time the clarity arrives, the men involved have usually already escaped into history. They have become untouchable icons. They have published memoirs, won awards, raised families, and been revered as the elder statesmen of rock and roll. The narrative was successfully scrubbed clean. The crimes were reclassified as youthful indiscretions. The girls they left behind received no such redemption. They received nothing at all. There were no private rehabilitation clinics paid for by the record labels for the discarded teenagers whose nervous systems were destroyed by the drugs pushed on them in the VIP rooms. There were no lucrative book deals to tell their side of the story. There was no public forgiveness because society blamed them for participating in the very system that was built to exploit them. This is the final obscenity of the myth. The child is first romanticized, then consumed, then blamed. The older, richer, more powerful adult walks away with the cultural benefit of complexity. He was troubled. He was brilliant. He was out of control. He was on drugs. He was a genius living through a wild era. The girl receives no such language. She is reduced to either a temptress, a fool, or a tragic casualty. She's denied the one thing the men are endlessly granted: context. But context is precisely what exposes the lie. The mythology collapses when exposed to the raw timeline. She was 14, operating in an environment built, narrated, monetized, and protected by adults. What was later sold as glamour was actually a world where very young girls were drawn into adult spaces under the protection of fame. And perhaps that is why culture has resisted restoring it for so long. To do so would mean rereading an entire era. It would mean looking back at photographs once treated as glamorous artifacts and seeing them instead as evidence of adult failure. It would mean revisiting album-era nostalgia and admitting that some of the same people celebrated as boundary-breaking artists moved through a world that failed to protect children. It would mean asking whether the industry, the media, and the public all participated in a convenient lie because the truth was too corrosive to the legend. That question still matters, not only because of the past, but because cultures that refuse to examine old patterns usually repeat them in new forms. Every era invents its own language to disguise imbalance. Every era produces its own excuses for why talent, beauty, or fame should complicate moral judgment. And every era discovers too late that glamour is one of the easiest ways to make harm look sophisticated. The story of Sable Starr is not only about one girl, one star, or one strip of road in Los Angeles. It is about how an entire culture can look directly at something disturbing and decide to call it art, freedom, rebellion, or style instead. It is about how adults rename what they do not want to confront. It is about how the vulnerable are told they are powerful so they will not notice how little power they actually have. And it all begins with two numbers, 25 and 14. That gap does not disappear because the soundtrack is good. It does not become profound because the clothes were iconic. It does not transform into liberation because the decade enjoyed calling itself free. It remains what it was, a chasm, a moral chasm, a developmental chasm, a power chasm. The whole glittering architecture of the myth was built to hide that gap in plain sight. But the gap remains visible. It appears in the photographs, the interviews, and the magazines that crown children as queens. Most tragically, It lived on in the later lives of the women who carried the damage, long after the men involved were absorbed into the permanent pantheon of rock history. Sable Starr lived the rest of her life away from the public stage, raising a family in Nevada. In 2009, she died of brain cancer at the age of 51. Her obituaries were brief, often reducing her entirely to her connections with the famous men of the 1970s. This final erasure highlights the ultimate tragedy of the era. The culture preferred to protect the mythology of its musical geniuses, leaving the true cost paid by young girls hidden behind a fading facade of glamour. Once you recognize the machinery that enabled this, the old story becomes impossible to tell in the same way again.